So our next session is going to be a really fantastic one. I'm here today in conversation with Kelly Weinersmith, who is one of the authors of a wonderful book called A City on Mars. Hands raised if you've read it already. Don't worry, she won't chase you if you haven't. Excellent. So Kelly is an accomplished author and adjunct assistant professor at Rice University. Her fascinating research spans from parasites infecting fish brains to wasps orchestrating the fate of their fellow insects. And I have to say, as a biologist, every bone in my body wants to lean into that, but not today. We'll do that another day. Alongside her partner, the renowned cartoonist Zach Weinersmith, she co-authored the acclaimed bestseller Soonish. Now in their latest work, A City on Mars, the Weinersmiths explore the allure and potential perils of human expansion into space. The book delves into topics ranging from reproductive challenges in space to governance dilemmas in extraterrestrial settlements. The Weinersmiths provide a thought-provoking examination of the complexities and uncertainties that are inherent in the quest to become a multiplanetary species. And they use their trademark wit and expertise and the brilliant illustrations from Zach to navigate the profound questions that humanity faces as we venture beyond Earth's boundaries. Help me welcome Kelly. Thanks. So Kelly, I have to kick us off first by asking, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, so we had written a book called Soonish about emerging technologies, and two of those technologies were space related. So one was cheap access to space, and it had some more like out there things like space elevators, but it also was talking about how SpaceX was rapidly dropping the cost of launching mass to space. And then there was another chapter on asteroid mining where we became convinced that we were like pretty close to mining the asteroids and using those resources to start space settlements. And so, we've read a bunch of books in the, written many decades ago about how space settlements are right around the corner. And we were like, people have been saying this forever, but now it's true. And we're ready to write the book about how in like the next decade or two, we're going to be having families on Mars. And Elon Musk says we're going to have 1 million people there in the next 3 decades. So we got excited about that. And you know that that's not the book we wrote.
So that is not the book they wrote.
That is not the book we wrote. So a couple years in, our editor very kindly told us, you should start again because you clearly don't believe the thesis that you set out to write initially. And so yeah, that's how we started on this book.
So that's interesting that you disbelieved your own thesis in the course of doing the research to support that thesis.
That's why research is important.
That's why research is super important.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to what kind of reaction you've seen from the community since the book has been published.
So, to be honest, the reaction has been really nice, mostly. So we've gotten a lot of nice emails from people saying saying nice things. We won't go into detail. We've gotten a couple people who have called us like the enemy. There are some people who aren't happy, and that's fine. I prefer when the critiques are friendly and we can sit down and have a discussion about the data. That hasn't always been the case, but in general, it's been received well, I think.
And you call this out in your book as well, that as scientists, we're taught to believe that the purpose of critique is to really dive into an idea and make sure it's a good idea, there's evidence to support it, and to open up avenues for what we could be doing differently. And you call that out in the book. It was a really important point. But we're at this interesting moment culturally where that doesn't always seem to be a touch point.
Yes, right. And I've spent too much time on Twitter, so I've had plenty of experience with people being angry and not wanting to have nice discussions. And I get it because like a lot of the people who are excited about space settlement, so like the rotating space settlement community, they're excited because they think we're going to move a bunch of humans off of Earth into space, and that's going to reduce the impacts of humans on Earth, and we can move heavy industry into space. And I guess I'm not convinced that we can do those things fast enough to save us from some of the problems that are barreling down at us, like climate change right now. But I get that if you really think that this is the thing we need to be doing to save the planet, we need to do it now, when someone is sort of negative about it, I get why you've got a heated emotional response to that. But I do think we get more done when we talk to each other nicely.
We also, I think, when we have these types of conversations and we end up seeing these very personal and emotional reactions to the ideas, a lot of times people think that's us responding to the technology, but actually I think those conversations might tell us more about ourselves than they tell us about the technology. So what types of emotional responses have you been encouraging? You said this orbiting spaceship people, they are really excited about orbiting spaceships. What other topics in the book brought up this kind of strong response?
Well, there's a community that's really excited about the idea of space as a new frontier, like the American West. There's some of that in the Mars Society. And we originally had a whole chapter in the book about the use of the frontier metaphor and how historians currently sort of view what happened on the frontier and the benefits of a frontier and stuff like that. And there's actually a bunch of macroeconomists who used the definition initially put forth in the Frontier Thesis, which was by Frederick Jackson Turner, to try to measure things like, do you actually get more upward mobility? Are people nicer to their neighbors? What happens with childhood mortality in these areas? And anyway, there's data on this stuff now. And so you can evaluate the critique that the frontier is going to increase democracy and increase innovation and stuff like that. And so we don't think there's super great evidence for a lot of that based on what the macroeconomists and historians are saying. And so that also didn't make us some friends, but we published that in Foreign Policy. That's the other most heated discussion I think we have.
I think this theme came through really clearly in the book, that people are going to be people, whether they're on Earth or whether they're someplace else.
Yes, there's pretty good data on that, and we read every biography that we could read, and I taught myself a little Russian so that I could try to do the cosmonaut memoirs too. And to me, it is very clear that humans go to space, and they're humans up there, and then they're humans when they come back down, and that doesn't change. We're going to bring our problems with us into space.
I've done 3 analog Mars simulations, and my takeaway from that is the technology is not the issue, the people are the issue.
Yeah, but there's a lot of big problems to solve, but I think we can do it. We just need to make sure we're thinking through it all.
Since you mentioned big problems, I want to lean into what I think is one of the real unique selling propositions of this book, which is that you all don't stop at rockets and radiation shielding. You take us on a much longer term journey to look at things like a little bit of economy. I think you had a footnote that your editor said that you should not to have too much economics in this book. I was a little disappointed, but
we still got plenty.
You still got some economy in there,
as
well as big questions about governance. So I think let's talk about both. Let's talk about the economic part first. One of the arguments that I hear and that frankly I make has to do with the market potential, the economic potential for expanding a human presence on Mars. What are the jobs going to be like on Earth? What new markets open? How do you feel about those types of arguments? Or I shouldn't ask about your feelings. What kind of evidence have you seen in favor or not in favor of those arguments?
Yeah, so the economic proposals that I've read for Mars settlements in particular, some of them hinge on a virtual or a reality TV show as a way to sort of fund stuff. I think that's probably, the interest in the Apollo missions went down pretty quick. So everybody watched Apollo 11, fewer people watched Apollo 12. There was almost no one tuning into Apollo 13 until the oxygen canister blew. And then we, dropped the last couple Apollo missions. And so I'm not sure that a reality TV show, the reality of living on Mars is probably going to be a lot of the toilet broke, we need to fix it. And we need to do farming and stuff like that. I don't know that it's going to be high drama. It'll be high drama, but it'll also be a lot of day-to-day stuff. Robert Zubrin says that there's going to be something like triangle trade, which makes me cringe every time I read that phrase, but something about extracting resources from the asteroids and maybe they get processed at Earth and Mars is somehow involved in that. I'm not quite sure that is a super convincing argument for economics because the stuff in the asteroids you could find on Earth, I'm not sure the economics works out yet given technologies in the near term. What are some of the best arguments that you've seen?
Well, I've seen things for jobs on Earth. I like those arguments quite a bit because if you widen the innovation ecosystem to think beyond rockets, what are we going to need for humans to not just survive but thrive off Earth?
Sure. Then
there's potential educational and job opportunities, health, food, energy, water, air, radiation, and.
Yeah.
And in my mind, this is a vast simplification, but to your point that space is really hard, Space to me is fundamentally a sustainability problem. So when we see all of this excitement, particularly in younger generations right now, about solving sustainability challenges, one of the things that I go out in the world and do, and that I would like to encourage all of you to do as well, is to say, hey, you know what, the space community also needs people who are interested in these various pieces of sustainability efforts, sustainability innovation. There's the innovation piece, and then of course there's the delivery piece, right? So at Explore Mars, we've got this wonderful trades program going on right now. No one ever talks about the plumbers or the electricians or the welders who make all this magic happen.
Yeah.
Those are jobs, and they're really important jobs. So from my point of view, because I spend so much time in the technology space, there's this narrative about the robots taking our jobs or the AI taking our jobs. And what I'm out there trying to say is new jobs, new capabilities. And so changing that cultural mindset from danger to opportunity is a really important thing that I think we need to be doing today.
Yeah, those jobs will be critical. I mean, like on the International Space Station, there's always stories about problems with the toilet. I think Peggy Whitson has a quote about needing to put a glove on to push the biomass down every once in a while. Like
Biomass.
That
was very classy.
Yes, if your toilet breaks in space, it's going to really be a problem. Like you've got a lot of problems with sterilization, especially in a place like the International Space Station, where if biological waste escapes, it's something you're breathing in. Getting this stuff right is critical, life-saving.
And again, I'm really tempted to lean into this from my analog experience with toilets, but I'm going to pass on that since we're heading to lunch pretty soon. Come see me later if you want to talk about that. So that's a piece of the economics piece. Now let's talk about the governance piece. And I think we don't talk about this a lot because, in my mind, for the foreseeable future, we're talking about very small communities off Earth. But for governance, that's going to need to kick in before there's a large enough group of people to actually need governance. So how do you view the governance issue? I'm sure there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, there's a lot of different directions it could go in, but so often when you talk to folks who are excited about space settlements, they'll either say that the first settlements are going to be a company town, because you're going to have a company starting a mining company, and that because you're so far away from everything, it's going to be the most extreme example of a mining or a company town ever, because they're going to have to provide not just like the sanitation and the education, the facilities for religious meetings, but also like the air that you breathe. So way more intense, but also quite unlike company towns on Earth. In some cases, you can't go home at all. So one of the things that economists say made company towns less bad, and of course we can all think of examples of company towns that went very bad, but some actually were pretty good, is labor mobility. So if your employer is treating you poorly, you can leave. If you're on Mars, maybe you have to wait until the next window because of orbital mechanics to leave, and then maybe, we don't really know how the human body is going to respond to 40% gravity. If you've been there for a decade, maybe you don't have the option of going home, or if you were born on Mars, maybe you don't have the option of going home. And so we've got a whole chapter on company towns. We also, the other most common sort of governance method that we came across in our research was communal living, and in particular, just how do you make communes work? And we quite often we'd come across people who would say like, oh, well, early communities in space are going to be communes. And we'd be like, oh, well, what will that be like? And they'd be like, well, we don't know. And we're like, but there's tons of literature on this. And so, and I understand the argument that, well, it's so far away that we haven't had to think about that yet. But now seems like a good time to start thinking about it as stuff is heating up. And so we reached out to some other scholars of communal movements, so the kibbutzim and the Hutterites and the 60s era communes. And it turns out that all of those communal movements have some pretty similar problems that they had to deal with in terms of how do you select members? When you have members, how do you keep them contributing equally to the group? Like what kind of punishments do you use to sort of get them back in line?
Space jail?
No space jail. Usually it's shaming, and which has some interesting psychological implications in an environment as harsh. And so like in the Hutterites, if you aren't doing your part or you're not sort of like following all of the rules, sometimes they'll like make adults go sleep with the children, or like their wives and the rest of the family are not allowed to talk to them, or they have to stand in the back of the church and nobody's allowed to talk to them. And that level of shunning is painful, and maybe even more painful if you're on Mars and like you can't call your mom back home because there's a 20-minute delay, and so like that could be even more isolating. But yeah, there's a lot of social sciences research that I think is applicable to space that I'd hopefully see more people getting into these days. Because every time I would write a researcher and be like, monopsony in space or communes in space, I immediately got a response from professors, and they'd be like, yes, I totally want to talk to you about what this would be like. And so I think there's a lot of people who are open to collaboration, and now's a good time to reach out to them, I think.
Quick pulse check.
Yeah.
Engineer that system before you go, or self-organize in situ as folks are really living the life?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we also thought about writing a chapter on how to construct constitutions, and we ended up deciding that is too far in the future. But we did start talking to constitutional scholars, and they said that there's a bunch of factors that are correlated with your constitution sticking around. And when a constitution fails, there's usually violence afterwards. So you want a constitution that sticks around. And the constitutions that tend to stick around are the ones that are created by the people who are there and have buy-in, and their values are reflected in the document. So there's things you can do to plan ahead of time, but there are things probably like constitutions where it's going to depend on who goes, and that's something that you might have to make later in the process. But there's scholars who can give you tips on what you should be doing when.
And your book contains a whole bunch of examples that we should be looking to on Earth, not just the analog Mars simulations, but as you said, these various communities that have already existed, or places where governance has actually worked here on Earth from an international collaboration. You point out two of those in particular. Why don't we share those? Because I always like it when we can say something really positive. Earth did something right.
Yes. So there are some good examples. So Antarctica, the deep seabed, and space all sort of started opening up at the same time as technology made these places more livable. In Antarctica, things were actually getting pretty tense after World War II. There's a chunk of Antarctica that's sort of pizza pie or pizza wedge shaped, where Britain, Chile, and Argentina had all made claims on the same chunk of land. And things were heating up, shots were fired, and other countries had made claims as well. But we were all able to come together and say, okay, we don't want to fight over this frosty wasteland. So we don't need to start a World War III. World War II was pretty unpleasant. So they came up with the Antarctic Treaty System. And so right now, you're not allowed to extract resources from Antarctica. This was part of the Madrid Protocol. And so that's a bummer for a lot of people who think that that's a missed opportunity, which I get. Those resources could be used by people that could be important. But on the other hand, we came across this situation where maybe we were going to start having conflict, and we found a peaceful way to coexist. And science gets done, and peace prevails, and there's still extraction of krill in the waters around Antarctica. But it gives me hope that if we do end up in a situation where maybe China and the US are in a bit of a race for the poles, where you've got the peaks of eternal light and the craters of eternal darkness with the water, that we could, even if things are getting tense, we could pull back and say, okay, let's come up with a system where we can do this peacefully and prioritize science and peace. And then the deep seabed is a place where it's an area that's also supposed to belong to everybody. And recently, the international seabed has started to establish rules for who can extract what, and how profits from that extraction may or may not be shared, and what's going to happen with technology transfer. So that's another case where there were resources, and we have managed to peacefully come up with a system for deciding. Well, we're in the process of trying to come up with that system, but no shots have been fired yet. So there's lots of reason to be optimistic that we can do this peacefully, but I think we need to be planning for conflict that could come in the future, and thinking about how we can try to reduce violent conflict, especially if I don't want a new space race with China because they're a nuclear power, and it would be nice if we could avoid another Cold War.
Yes, and your book really does go into the conflict issues. Nukes in space, scary.
Scary, currently not prohibited through the UN Outer Space Treaty. There was some talk recently of Russia maybe wanting to put a nuke in space. I think that maybe that was misinterpreted, or it was some lone person who got quoted. Anyway, but yes, we do not want nukes in space, and currently that's would be violating international treaties.
And that's why the decisions we make today in terms of our international partnerships and the norms and regulations and laws that get put in place today are so important, because they're going to reverberate for decades to come into the future as the human presence off Earth becomes larger and more sustained.
Yeah, and when I talk to young people and they ask me like, what field should I go into? I try to convince a lot of them that like, okay, I know international law sounds boring, and we had to convince our editor that 5 chapters wasn't too much on international law, and so we tried to put as many jokes and fun stories in there as we could. But yeah, if you're one of the people who sort of figures out the path that humanity is going to take as we move out into space, like you could be impacting humanity's future for hundreds, thousands of years to come.
I mean, international lawyer might sound a little boring, but space lawyer.
Space lawyer.
That's super sexy, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that exists.
That
Like
exists.
outside of sci-fi movies and stuff. I was surprised to learn that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So a lot of the concepts we just talked about are brilliantly and hilariously illustrated in the book. Tell us a little bit about the decision to include those illustrations, and what kind of negotiations did you and your co-author / husband have to go through to decide what would actually end up being illustrated?
Well, so it was my husband and me and our editor. And so our editor wanted more illustrations. So our first book together had a lot of illustrations, and they also, like, they were sort of added jokes to the text. For A City on Mars, we wanted it to be a little bit more, the illustrations sort of help show concepts and explain things, so a little bit less of a joke and more of a like assistance for some of the more difficult concepts. But our editor wanted fewer words and more pictures, and my husband and I like could have written a 500,000 page book instead of a 100,000 page book. So we were pushing for fewer illustrations, and we were on the same page. But you know, we'll write a chapter, and then my husband will put in brackets like, I think we could use an illustration here about this, that, or the other thing. And usually I'm just like, that's fine, that's great, because that's his domain of expertise, and he's great at it. So often I just kind of am like, yep, you got that. But every once in a while there'd be a joke where I'd be like, oh, that joke's not landing, or that concept doesn't really need an illustration, but this one does. And so yeah, it's back and forth. The whole process is back and forth. He did half the research, and we drafted chapters and sent them back and forth. And usually it wasn't too tense. And usually our children were not bored by our conversations about interpretation of international law. But my daughter did ask me to please not come to her class to talk about space.
My kid does that too. Mom,
Yeah.
please don't.
Can you believe it?
I know. No
She's in
gratitude.
4th grade, and she's like, no, you're going to talk about space law. And I was like, I would try not to. And she's like,
But no promises.
but no promises. And she's like, no, I know you. You're going to talk about the law.
In a moment, we're going to transition to Q&A. If you have a question for Kelly, I'd invite you to come down and line up in front of the microphone. We'll give you just a moment to come forward. So since we were talking about kids, you mentioned space lawyer, job of the future. What other jobs of the future would you tell people to go home and talk to their families about?
Oh, I mean, there's so many problems that need to be solved, and we're thinking of these as opportunities now.
That's right.
Yes, so I mean, I would love to see us learn a lot more about reproduction in space. So there have been some experiments that have been done on the International Space Station, but it's been more like, I can get a rat up there for a third of its gestation, and it's going to go up and down, and so now it's not just microgravity, which is very stressful, and it doesn't have a lot of time to adapt, but it also has like hypergravity as it falls back down to Earth. Probably all of those things are bad for pregnancy, and maybe much worse than just being in free fall constantly. And we know very little about how bodies respond to 40% gravity or the radiation in space beyond the magnetosphere. And so I think space reproduction is one of the more scary sort of ethical things that we're going to have to deal with. And so, when Musk says we're going to have 1 million people on Mars in 2 to 3 decades, so he'll say, you don't have to do that through having reproduction. You can just send 1 million people there. But I've met people, and if you have 1 million of them, they're going to have some babies, and it would be good to know ahead of time if how safe that's going to be and what kind of problems you can expect to have. So I'd love to see a research station on the moon, for example, where first we run through a couple generations of rodents and say, okay, that seems like it's going okay. Let's bring our dogs and other animals out there and just sort of confirm that things seem okay. And the moon has even less gravity than Mars, so if it works out on the moon, it's probably going to be okay on Mars. But
I had to laugh in the last panel where Shauna was saying, oh, if we have to do a space C-section, we have some questions. I'm like, really? You have questions? I feel like it's pretty clear what happened there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I'm happy to keep talking to Kelly about space babies, which I will do. Again, I'd like to invite you to come share your questions. This is a really wonderful opportunity. Come on down front to the mic. Oh, good. Yes, sir. Tell us your question.
Hello, my name's David Smith. I'm just curious what's your thinking around leisure and entertainment activities in a city on Mars, I mean, how important that would be, and do you foresee the potential for, movie theaters, stage theaters, and people, the ability to play sport, whether that's soccer fields, tennis courts, how important and how possible would all that be?
It's true, you missed a chapter on space sports.
Oh, we did. Michio Kaku has that covered in his book, a whole chapter on space sports and how they'll be probably more beautiful than on Earth, which does sound pretty awesome. So we originally had a chapter in the book where we had read a bunch of memoirs from polar expeditions that lasted like many years, and it's a bunch of people in a small space. We also read a lot about life in Antarctic research stations where they've got the long winter and they're again in a confined space, they can't go outside much. And NASA, they've got this human integration design handbook where they've also gone through all of this stuff, and they have a lot of suggestions, like the food needs to be good for mental health. You should be able to contact loved ones. It's nice if resupplies include letters from loved ones. The smell of fresh fruit ends up being like a bunch of memoirs that we read. They'd be like, oh, the Progress resupply came and you could smell the apples, and they get excited about onions and lemons and all sorts of things that we take for granted. But so, sports would be great. It takes a lot of pressurized space, and so I don't know if very early on we're likely to have tennis courts or something like that, but these sorts of ways to maintain mental health are really important, and there are a lot of places that NASA has already gone to sort of figure out what works. So yeah, we've got a system for that, and it's super important.
I'll just very quickly give a shout out to Explore Mars CEO Chris Carberry, who has written 2 pertinent books on these subjects, Alcohol in Space, which I highly recommend, and Music in Space. So if you're interested in entertainment and leisure offer, be sure to check out those books. Yes, hello.
I wanted to ask this at the last panel, but I'll ask you. I have not read the book yet, I apologize, I haven't though. Did the book cover at all the really angry people, the ones who would be willing to harm systems to harm others, and any countermeasures you do to stop that kind of thing?
Yeah, so Charles Kell is a UK researcher who's really interested in questions about how being in an environment where it would be so easy to harm a lot of people could change opportunities for liberty. So for example, if somebody is really mad at everybody, maybe you shunned the person in your commune and they had to sleep with the kids and they decided they were furious and they want to open the airlock. What happens when you're in an environment where one person can hurt everybody so easily? And so he was worried that there'd be a lot more risk of like totalitarianism. So everybody being surveilled all the time, and if anybody is starting to act out of the ordinary, what would happen to them? And so he's been thinking about how you can design habitats to sort of support freedom, and so that you can still keep an eye on everyone, keep everybody safe, but while still allowing some individuality. We started on a chapter about punishments, looking at corporal punishment throughout the world. How likely is it that we'd end up having corporal punishment based on where we see it happening here? And then we were reading about the Navy in the era of flogging and how the transition when you decided it was no longer okay to flog worked out. And it was rather inconvenient because flogging is a quick thing that gets the person back. I'm not advocating for flogging, but it's a quick thing that gets the person back on the crew. Whereas if you need to put them in a prison cell, now they're out of commission, somebody has to watch them, that person's out of commission, the rest of the crew is feeling grumpy because that other person isn't working, and then you have to go out of your way to bring them somewhere else so that you can drop them off somewhere at another prison so that you're not wasting that space. And so these sorts of questions could be difficult. They need to be planned for ahead of time. And I think it's good to plan ahead of time so you can try to find more humane ways to deal with these sorts of things.
And I could see someone saying, well, you just pre-screen for that kind of behavior, but you were very, very clear in your book about how much lying goes into those psychological screens.
Yeah, so astronauts lie a lot. And let's be clear, astronauts are they're better people than I am. They're more physically fit, they have better mental health, they're wonderful human beings. But if you read their memoirs, they admit to lying a lot. And it's because there's incredible incentive to lie. Everybody when they're a kid wants to be an astronaut. These people have made it. And if they call down to mission control and they're I think I'm gonna have a panic attack, then maybe they don't get to go back up again. Or if they're not going to want to call the flight surgeon and say, I think maybe I'm having a heart attack the night before a flight, which happened to some guy. He went to a secret doctor because he thought he was having a heart attack, but he didn't tell anybody else. Mike Mullane, in the era before digital records, pulled the papers out of his medical records before handing it to the surgeon, because some sweet summer child decided it would be or it would be okay to give him his own records and let him hand them to the flight surgeon. And so he just pulled out anything that looked bad. And anyway,
Bold move.
Bold move, that's right. Well, but he even says in his book, if somebody said, it looks like you have a glass eye, he's like, I would have said, prove it, even if I had a glass eye. So some people are aggressive in their lies. And you find women admitting also that when they talk to the psychiatrists or psychologists saying, look, I'm not going to tell you if I'm not feeling great because I want to go to space and I've gotten this far. And so anyway, there's a lot of incentive to say you're fine, even if you're not fine. So we might not have great data on mental health in space. But if you look at Antarctic Research Station and submarines, when you take carefully screened people and you train them, they tend to do fairly well in isolated and confined environments. So the question to me is, what happens when you bring people like me up there who wouldn't make it through that screening? Or the children of astronauts who, who knows, maybe they wouldn't have made it through the screening. When you have settlements, you're just going to have all of us, all the rest of us with all of our problems. And so you're going to need to plan for that.
Yes, and to make sure that we end on a positive note.
Sorry.
No, you're good. My fault as the moderator. Kelly, you and Zach end the book by talking about, despite all of these really strong challenges you've pointed out, you remain optimistic. Tell us why.
I mean, it's awesome. I think it would be very cool if we did it, and a lot of the problems that we need to solve and the information we need to get before we make this happen, these are really interesting problems to research. And if you look at closed loop ecosystems and you figure out how to more efficiently use resources, that can only help us here on Earth. And so I think that the work that we still need to do is exciting, invigorating work. And maybe we won't have a settlement in Mars in my lifetime. And I brought it down again, and I'm supposed to bring it back up again, but there's cool work to do, so let's work on that.
Great. Kelly is going to be signing copies of her book for the next hour, half hour?
I think 30 minutes.
Foreseeable future.
Foreseeable future.
So if you have not already purchased a copy, you need to do that through the Eventbrite link. But this is a wonderful opportunity to get a personalized copy. And if you have any questions that you were too shy to ask at the mic, please make sure that you are having conversations with folks. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thanks, Tiffany.